Hi. So we're going to talk about the third category of informal fallacies, which are fallacies of weak induction. Fallacies of weak induction are fallacies in which there is a weak connection between the premises and the conclusion. So if you remember that inductive arguments were arguments where you have some evidence that leads you to a conclusion, and the conclusion is probably true, it could be wrong, and it depends on how much evidence or how strong that evidence is for that conclusion. In the fallacies of weak induction, that connection is so weak, maybe even non-existent, that that it's considered a fallacy. It's not considered a good argument. And often people fall prey to this kind of argument because there's an emotional hook in it, or because there's a weak connection, and so even that weak connection we consider as some sort of evidence for the conclusion. There are three types of these fallacies: appeal to an unqualified authority, false cause, and hasty generalization. So remember we talked about the obedience to authority cognitive bias, and that's what's at play when someone commits the fallacy of an appeal to an unqualified authority. So if you look at this actual ad from like the 50s for these cigarettes, you have a dentist who is an authority figure. People see dentists, medical professionals as authority figures, and this dentist is recommending this type of cigarette. So, in an unqualified authority fallacy, the arguer is using an alleged authority, in this case a dentist, as evidence to the argument. But this authority figure may not really be an authority on the facts that are relevant to the argument. So, maybe, the dentist is an authority on your teeth, but not necessarily on cigarettes. Um, we went over these examples when we talked about inductive arguments. So, in this case, you had a district attorney arguing that Sam Thomas was murdered because Mr. O'Toole testified that he saw Thomas shoot the chef. So in this case, the authority is Mr. O'Toole as the eyewitness. Again, it's an inductive argument, right? Could be wrong. But what if Mr. O'Toole is blind or has dementia or has hallucinations? That makes the connection so weak, even before it was just evidence for a conclusion that was probably true, but not certainly true. But now that we know these other things about Mr. O'Toole, it makes the connection so weak that it's not a good argument and it's a fallacy. Similarly, we talked about this one. Dr. Hart, a cardiologist, said I need a pacemaker, so I must need one. Doctors could be wrong. Under normal circumstances, you could say this is a pretty good inductive argument because Dr. Hart is a cardiologist, an expert on the heart. But what if we had some other information, like Dr. Hart had been sued numerous times for malpractice or was getting money from the manufacturer of the pacemaker? That would make us question his authority in this case and weaken that connection, and therefore turn this into a fallacy instead of a good argument. So, another type of unqualified authority fallacy that we see a lot is celebrity endorsements. These are really good examples. So, here you have various celebrities endorsing various products. They're all celebrities and stars and good at what they do or did. They're probably not experts in the actual product that they are endorsing here, but because people see them as stars and big shots and very talented in their various ways, um, people ascribe that sort of power to them of knowing what's going on or having that sort of authority. They might be the authority in Selena's case on singing or acting or playing basketball, but they're not experts on the products that they're endorsing. So celebrity endorsements is a great example of unqualified authority fallacy. So again, with this fallacy, you want to do these checks. Is the authority trustworthy? Are they an expert on the subject that's relevant to the argument? Is the authority biased or have a motive to lie? And is the testimony, if that's the case of the authority being a eyewitness testimony, do they actually provide genuine evidence for the conclusion? So if they're not trustworthy or an expert, and if they're not providing genuine evidence, and instead they're biased, you're probably dealing with a fallacy. If the opposite is the case, then you may actually have a legitimate argument. All right. The second type of fallacy of weak induction is called false cause. And here, the causal connection that the arguer believes to exist between the cause and effect doesn't actually exist, or it's highly questionable. This is just a funny comic. It's not really an illustration of this, but sometimes you hear this: correlation is not causation. That's exactly what we're talking about here. That just because two things may happen close to each other, it doesn't mean that one caused the other one. This boy is trying to argue this, but probably trying to get out of this fact that he broke the TV. What usually hooks us is that there is a correlation between the two events. Again, one occurs near the other, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the one caused the other. It could be a coincidence, or there could be some other factor. So there are a few different types of false cause. Post hoc ergo propter hoc. And this one is where the arguer assumes that because one event came before another event, or there's some sort of temporal succession, temporal meaning time, succession meaning one coming after the other, then A must have caused B. But just because one happened after the other doesn't mean that one caused the other. So, for example, superstitions work a lot like this. You can't wash my game socks. I've worn them for the last 3 weeks and I've made every basket I've attempted. So this person is thinking that just because they wear the socks and then play basketball and they do well in basketball, it's because of the socks, right? Superstitions, again, are all of this form. Non causa pro causa. So this is a mistake about cause and effect, but not because of temporal succession. So again, they're making a mistake about what caused the other thing, but it doesn't have to do with time. So for example, this girl is saying, yeah, well, I only failed my logic exam because I'm Pisces and my professor's a Leo, right? So they're ascribing the reason they didn't do well on their exam to their astrological sign, as opposed to what could be the actual reason, which is maybe not studying enough, or making some mistakes. And then oversimplified cause. So this is where there could be many causes responsible for a particular effect, and the arguer just picks one of them. So, for example, children's reading level has declined steadily since video games became popular. Obviously, video games are the cause, and something needs to be done. So again, there could be other reasons why the reading level has declined, right? It's probably not just video games. Video games could be a factor, right? But again, this is called oversimplified cause. But to draw the conclusion that video games are the cause is a fallacy. So to avoid false cause, determine if the argument is a causal one, if you actually have a causal relationship, or if it's just like one thing happened after the other. And then also see maybe there's other factors responsible for what happened, rather than just the one that the arguer is arguing for. Okay. And then the last fallacy is called hasty generalization. This is when a sample is not representative of a group because it's either too small or atypical. So remember, we did some inductive arguments about there's a basket of apples and 10 of them were delicious, so the other 5 will probably be delicious. That would probably be a pretty good argument because you got 10 out of the 15 apples, right? But if the sample were too small or not representative, that wouldn't necessarily be a good argument, and we'd call that hasty generalization. So, for example, you see one car do something, and this person says, all sports car drivers are so aggressive, right? So you see a couple of examples of someone who drives a particular type of car or a particular type of person do something, and then you make a generalization about that entire group, right? So it's too small of a sample, and it's not really a randomly selected sample. And it's not randomly selected because it's only when you notice it. Let's look at this video from Batman.
Holy Heidelberg, what'd you do that for?
I'm afraid we've been drugged, Robin.
I guess you could never trust a woman.
You made a hasty generalization, Robin. It's a man I would just get into. But in this situation, it's entirely apropos.
All right, so some cheesy Batman. So Batman's telling Robin, like, hey, you did a hasty generalization there. Just because one woman did something bad to us doesn't mean all women shouldn't be trusted. Um, or, for example, if one girl says to another, there have been a number of cases recently where teenage girls were sexually assaulted by football players. So all guys that play football are deviants and should not be trusted. So this is another type where if you see that, okay, there's this common characteristic amongst sexual assaults, then you assume everyone in that category now commits sexual assault, right? Or if so, it could be true that most of the people involved with domestic abuse or committing domestic abuse are men, does not necessarily mean that most or all men are domestic abusers, right? Because you're just looking at an atypical sample of men. You're just looking at a particular group of men that do this. It's not representative of the entire group. So um, those are things that lead to hasty generalization, which stereotyping is a form of, right? And if you're thinking like, hey, that's like stereotyping, it is. Stereotyping is a form of hasty generalization. Um, Here's another famous example that I'm sure all of you have seen.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Okay, so I'm sure you've all seen that clip before. So it's good to ask, like, is the sample that you're talking about, the people he's talking about, is that representative of the entire group, or is it atypical? Right? He's only talking about a few people. It's too small, maybe the sample. And think about whether the conclusion is based on a stereotype, which President Trump is playing off of here, a stereotype of both Mexicans and immigrants. So those are um, the three fallacies of weak induction. After watching this video, you can check your understanding by taking the